Welcome to the forest, where thunder had a name, and it wasn't the sky. It was the 15-centimeter sFH 13, the heavy field howitzer that tore through trees like matchsticks and turned earth into air. Imagine standing there in the Argonne 1915 silence. Then a crack, a shriek, and the whole world heaves forward. Allied soldiers called it the voice of doom, because once it spoke, no man could outrun the echo. Every shell screamed before it landed, and every scream was a countdown. September 1915. Verdun sector. The woods smell of cordite and pine sap, the air thick with mist and breath. In the German lines, gun crews move like clockwork under canvas tarps soaked with rain. Boots grind, mud gears click, and a massive shell 43 kilograms of steel and explosive slides into the breach. A sergeant wipes his hands on his tunic, nods once, and the order comes. Feuer. The blast is not a sound, but a shove. The gun recoils, the earth ripples, and somewhere across the no-man's land, a French observation post simply stops existing. For those who heard it from the other side, the memory burned permanent. One British corporal later wrote, "The woods did not explode. They folded." That's what the sFH 13 did. It folded the world in on itself. It didn't need accuracy. It needed terror. The Allies could dig deeper trenches, they could pray for fog, but nothing dulled the rhythm of that weapon. The thump, the hiss, the rising whistle, the bloom of fire. The gun itself stood taller than a man, its steel carriage braced by wooden wheels bound with iron, its shield bent forward like a beast's jaw. It weighed over 2 metric tons, yet the crews could move it through forest trails using 6 horses and pure endurance. Designed by Rheinmetall in 1913, the model name Schwer Feldhaubitze 13, it fired a 149mm shell with a muzzle velocity of roughly 350 meters per second. On paper, it was just numbers. In the field, it was punishment. The shrapnel radius exceeded 100 meters. That meant no foxhole was safe if you heard it coming. Now picture the opposing trenches, muddy scars across France. The men who faced these guns often never saw them. They only felt their presence, the ground pulsing beneath their boots, the sky trembling before dawn. Allied spotters reported entire platoons vanishing after single barrages. At Verdun, at Ypres, at the Somme, whenever forests stood, the howitzers followed. They fired from behind tree lines, from ravines, from barns turned into fortresses, always unseen, always certain. In the archives of the British Expeditionary Force, a field report dated October 1915 reads, "Enemy batteries of heavy howitzers have established superiority of fire in wooded sectors. Morale severely affected. Casualties extreme." A line beneath it, handwritten, adds, "They fire through the trees as if the forest were air, and that's the secret." The German artillery learned to use the woods as an amplifier. Trees broke the wind, masked the flash, and sent echoes bouncing like ghosts. Allied scouts could never locate the exact position. A single gun could sound like 10. The illusion was perfect until the shells landed. But this story is not just about steel and shockwaves, it's about the men behind the thunder. Imagine the gunners, sleeves rolled, faces, blackened ears ringing, working through rain mud, and orders that never stopped. They loaded by hand, by willpower, by fear. Some called it an art, others a curse. Between firings, they smoked silently, staring at the trees they were slowly erasing. One corporal wrote in his diary, "We have become the storm. The forest no longer belongs to God." By late 1915, the 15-centimeter sFH 13 had earned a reputation among both sides. For the Germans, it was the hammer of discipline, dependable, brutal, almost holy. For the Allies, it was the monster in the fog, the thing you prayed not to hear. Artillery duels became symphonies of madness, counter-batteries firing blindly into smoke explosions, echoing off trunks like 100 drummers. The forest turned musical in a way percussion of shells whined instruments of death, strings of screaming timber. Historians later called it the howitzer age, the moment war became math. Range tables fused settings, elevation angles, men transformed into living calculators. Each battery had to coordinate timing down to seconds. If the shell landed too short, you killed your own. Too far, and the enemy regrouped. There was no romance left, only precision, repetition, annihilation. And yet beneath that mechanical rhythm, there was mythology. Soldiers whispered that the guns had moods that some mornings they refused to fire as if sensing a coming storm. They gave them names: Brunhilde the Iron Maiden, Old Thunder. In the half-light before battle, a loader might pat the barrel like a horse muttering a prayer. It was superstition, but it mattered because superstition kept men human when logic turned monstrous. As the camera of history zooms in, we see the cost. Forests shredded into splinters, rivers filled with mud, and men-animals fleeing nowhere. When the sFH-13 spoke, it spoke to all of nature: the birds, the rain, the bones of the earth, and even silence after the last round refused to return. Now imagine you're there. You're a 20-year-old private crouched in a trench somewhere north of Verdun. The air smells like rot and rust. You've been awake for 36 hours. The officer beside you suddenly freezes, his head, tilted eyes scanning the treetops. Then you hear it, that low, swelling hum, rising higher, faster, until it pierces the marrow of your teeth. You don't think. You don't breathe. You just wait for the world to end again. They say thunder is only frightening when it's close, but this thunder never leaves. It lingers, rolls, seeps into the lungs. That's why Allied soldiers wrote home describing the sound more than the pain. Because how do you describe a weapon that can erase a hill, a memory, a name? And yet, even amid that terror, there's a strange beauty in the symmetry of the weapon and the forest. Both ancient forces, both alive in their own rhythm. The trees absorb the sound, the gun releases it, and between them, humanity hangs in the echo. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact minute you're listening. Imagine the ground under your feet trembling with every word, every note of thunder that history still remembers. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story of steel and fire, it's the sound of fear made real, and the men who learned to command it. October 1915, Champagne, Ardennes. The fog lies thick over the front, and the forest seems half alive, half dead. Broken branches twist into silhouettes, and from deep within that gray maze, a dull, rhythmic pulse begins to grow, one that doesn't belong to the earth or the sky. The German sFH-13 batteries have been rolled into position during the night, each cannon masked beneath camouflage nets, strung between tree trunks blackened by smoke. The men move like shadows, boots sinking into wet soil, hands wrapped in cloth against the cold steel of ammunition cases. A faint glow flickers under a tarpaulin, where an officer reads coordinates from a crumpled paper, a target village 5 kilometers away. The map trembles slightly from the vibration of another gun firing nearby. No one speaks. Orders here are gestures, nods, and the hiss of breath between clenched teeth. Far to the west, the Allied trenches stretch like open wounds across the plain. The British Expeditionary Force has dug itself in, unaware that the next barrage will not come from the usual direction. The Howitzers are hidden within the tree line. The Germans have learned to angle their guns so the sound ricochets, confusing enemy spotters. A French liaison officer writes in his notebook, "It sounds like thunder coming from all directions, impossible to tell where death begins." The forest amplifies everything, the concussions bouncing from tree to tree like rolling drums. The men in the forward observation posts strain their ears, counting the seconds between report and impact, trying to estimate range, but the sound plays tricks. Sometimes it arrives late, sometimes it arrives twice. The sFH-13 Schwere Feldhaubitze 13 is more than a weapon. It's the symbol of a new era of war where the earth itself becomes a machine. Designed by Rheinmetall in the years before the Great War, it was meant to deliver heavy shells over long distances without sacrificing mobility. The recoil system absorbs the force that once shattered older carriages. The hydraulic cylinders hiss softly as the barrel slams backward, then returns smoothly into position. Each gun crew is trained to maintain a firing rate of 2 rounds per minute, methodical, relentless. Every round must be lifted, loaded, and aimed by hand. The shell's brass casing gleams briefly before disappearing into the chamber where it meets the powder charge and fuse. One wrong motion, and the entire gun could detonate. But in these woods, hesitation is death. For the Germans, artillery is not support, it is doctrine. The concept of Feuerwalze, the rolling barrage, is being perfected here. Each howitzer coordinates with others along the line to create a moving wall of explosions. The sound merges into a single roar that feels almost natural, like a storm sweeping across the land. But to those caught within it, it's the voice of organized destruction. The French soldiers call it le tonnerre allemand, the German thunder. And when that thunder rolls, men instinctively press themselves into the mud, praying the next shell is not meant for them. The forests of the Western Front, Argonne, Verdun, Bois de Malancourt, Bois des Buttes, become laboratories of annihilation. Artillery leaves nothing untouched. The trees are shredded into spears, roots are torn from the earth mingled with corpses and shell fragments. In one report from the 77th Infantry Division, a medic describes walking through what used to be a forest. The trunks had no tops, the ground no color, the air no sound, except for the constant crying of the wounded. This is not the war of cavalry and courage the men were promised. It's a war of math trajectory, elevation, distance, charge, weight, all reduced to tables and angles. The gunners don't see their targets. They hear them vanish. Somewhere near Saint-Mihiel, a German artillery lieutenant named Karl Bäumer records his impressions in a small notebook. When the order came to fire, we felt the world pause, he writes. Each blast was a commandment, our own hearts followed its rhythm. His crew has been firing for 3 hours straight. Their uniforms are soaked with sweat despite the cold. Powder residue clings to their skin like soot. Between rounds, one man drinks water mixed with coffee, grounds another, rubs oil onto the breech to prevent jamming. They work by routine detached, but when a shell misfires, time stretches into terror. The gunner's hands hover over the mechanism, waiting to see if the round will detonate. Seconds pass. Then silence. Relief comes in laughter, sharp and hollow. Across the line, Allied counter-batteries scramble to respond. Observation balloons rise above the haze, their crews scanning for muzzle flashes. But the German guns are ghosts hidden under camouflage nets relocated every few hours, shielded by terrain. One British observer complains in his report, "We fire blindly at sound, and sound deceives us. The counter-barrage answers nothing. The forest absorbs it, shrugs it off, and the German thunder resumes. Night falls. The temperature drops. The German crews light small stoves beneath canvas shelters, their faces lit by the flicker of flame. The men speak little. Each one has lost hearing in at least one ear. Their voices come out flat and loud. A sergeant named Helmut writes home to his wife in Hanover, describing the routine: we live with the gun. We eat beside it, we sleep beside it. Its echo stays in our dreams. When it fires, I feel alive. When it is silent, I feel afraid. These forests, once filled with birdsong and resin, now breathe smoke. The soil smells of metal and rain. Rats scurry across shell casings. Crows circle overhead. And through this ruin, the howitzers continue to speak. Each barrage is coordinated with infantry assaults timed down to the minute. The shells fall in waves, high explosive first, then shrapnel, then gas. The forest becomes a maze of chemical fog. Allied soldiers stumble coughing, clawing at their masks, while German infantry advances behind the barrage step by step. The howitzers adjust range again, lifting their fire forward by 50 meters at a time. Its precision dressed as chaos mathematics dictating life and death. In the Allied trenches, morale begins to crack. Letters intercepted from French soldiers speak of fear, not of the enemy's faces, but of their unseen hands. One writes, "I would rather face their rifles than their thunder." Another adds, "The ground trembles even when they do not fire." I think the forest remembers. The myth of the invincible German artillery spreads faster than fact. Rumors claim the howitzers can hit any target, that their shells can curve in midair, that the guns themselves move on rails hidden beneath the woods. None of it true, yet every man believes. The weather worsens. Rain turns trenches into swamps, but the guns keep firing. Water seeps into powder boxes, fuses fail, barrels crack under stress. Still replacements arrive. The German war machine feeds itself with steel and willpower. At the Krupp and Rheinmetall factories back home, production runs day and night. Thousands of shells leave the lines weekly, marked with serial numbers and destination tags, Argonne, Verdun, Somme. The front demands more, always more. And the sound of the sFH-13, that deep-throated mechanical growl, becomes the heartbeat of an empire at war. By winter, the forest has no leaves left. The guns are buried under snow, camouflaged against the pale horizon. From a distance, they look like skeletal beasts sleeping. But when the order comes, the forest wakes again. Snow erupts in fountains, light flashes through fog, and the sound returns, that ancient rolling fury that once made even seasoned officers flinch. Somewhere beyond the line, in a ruined farmhouse, an Allied radio operator murmurs, "The thunder has started again." What began as a single artillery piece has multiplied into hundreds. The Germans now field entire regiments of heavy howitzers, their positions rotating constantly to avoid detection. Each unit has its own code name: Donner, Sturm, Gutterhammer. To the men who serve them, these names feel like family. The howitzer is both weapon and companion, the one constant in a war that devours everything else. The front lines freeze under sleet and mud, and time loses meaning. The guns mark hours, not clocks. One firing at dawn means rations. 2 at noon means reposition. 3 at dusk means counterattack. Soldiers measure their lives in sound, not days. Somewhere in that gray horizon between trees and sky, history is taking shape. The forest will not survive it. The men will not either. But the echo that will remain long after the last barrel cools, long after the names of towns and trenches are forgotten. And in that echo lies the heartbeat of modern warfare, born not from glory, but from the relentless rhythm of the 15-centimeter sFH-13. Fact, that is where the myth begins to bleed. The numbers alone tell a story colder than steel. By early 1916, over 3,500 units of the 15-centimeter sFH-13 had been produced across the German Empire, each one consuming nearly 5 tons of forged metal, thousands of man-hours, and the labor of entire factory towns. Its shells, the 15-centimeter 14, weighed precisely 43.5 kilograms, with a bursting charge of almost 7 kilograms of TNT or picric acid. Fired at an elevation of 45 degrees, it could hurl destruction nearly 8.5 kilometers far enough that the gunners never saw what they killed. The weapon's recoil system, a hydropneumatic marvel, allowed it to fire again in seconds, resetting itself, breathing steady, mechanical, unstoppable. Reports from the German War Ministry describe efficiency as art. A well-trained crew can sustain a rate of 2 rounds per minute for over 30 minutes, the document reads. That means 60 shells in half an hour over 2.5 tons of explosives dropped on an area smaller than a village square. Multiply that by a battery of 4 guns, then by an entire division. This was industrial annihilation destruction, scaled, standardized, and scheduled. The sound of thunder had a timetable. The Allies were not blind to it. They gathered intelligence from captured manuals, interrogated prisoners, studied fragments of spent shells. British ordnance officers examined the steel casings, noting the superior German metallurgy, cleaner welds, tighter tolerances, more reliable fuses. One officer, Major H.E. Payne, wrote in his assessment, "Their guns are built not only to kill, but to endure. We cannot match their longevity. Ours tire, theirs sing." The statement was as much admiration as warning. From an engineering perspective, the sFH-13 bridged 2 eras. It was born of 19th century design, but fought a 20th century war. It still relied on horses for transport. Yet it introduced innovations that would shape every artillery piece to come: quick-fire recoil dampers, elevation arcs that allowed high-angle bombardment, and shells designed for fragmentation rather than mere impact. In effect, it transformed the landscape itself into the weapon. Trees became shrapnel. Mud became fire. Even silence became a kind of pressure. Field tests by the Germans proved the weapon's efficiency against fortifications. In March 1916, during the opening weeks of Verdun, a single regiment of heavy howitzers fired 300,000 rounds in 10 days. French observers counted no fewer than 20 villages reduced to rubble, some erased so completely that post-war maps could not locate them again. A letter from a French artillery captain reads, "There are no lines anymore, only craters that once had names." That was the effect of the 15-centimeter sFH-13. It did not win ground, it removed it. At the tactical level, the Germans built their entire attack doctrine around these guns. Infantry no longer charged blindly across open fields. Instead, they advanced behind carefully timed barrages, creeping fire that rolled forward in synchronized waves. Each shell landed 50 meters ahead of the troops, lifting the curtain of death just as the men moved. The effect, when executed perfectly, was like a machine breathing shell step, shell step. The howitzers led the advance. Men merely followed the rhythm. Even the logistics behind them were feats of grim precision. Each gun required a supply train of 40 horses, 4 wagons of ammunition swung, and a maintenance crew armed with tools more than rifles. The shells arrived packed in wooden crates marked with black stenciled numbers, lot batch fuse type. Nothing was left to chance. At night, the supply lines stretched for kilometers, flickering with lanterns, as men hauled the next round of thunder into position. The Allied intelligence summaries of 1916 show an obsession with the numbers. Each German heavy battery averages 600 rounds per day, one report notes. The psychological effect on our troops is disproportionate to the actual casualties. That phrase, psychological effect, would later define the artillery war. Because most soldiers were not killed by shells, they were unmade by the waiting. A shell could land anywhere, anytime. The forest whispered with the possibility of instant erasure. Inside German command headquarters at Montmedy, the artillery officers mapped destruction with mathematical elegance. Large tables lined with grid maps, pencils ticking over coordinates, telephones ringing with updates from observers. Feuerlinie dry, shift 2 degrees north, fire 6 rounds, an operator would say. Moments later, miles away, an entire section of forest would vanish. The system worked terrifyingly well. At Verdun alone, German heavy artillery expended over 2.4 million rounds in the first 2 months. Contemporary historians estimate that the majority of casualties were caused not by bullets, but by these very shells. Amid all this precision, there remained the element no calculation could capture: fear. The diaries of both sides mention it with the same words. The sound starts in the stomach. A rumble, then a whine, then the collapse. One British chaplain noted men ceased to pray for safety. They prayed for silence, and silence never came. Even between barrages, the earth groaned, shifting from the concussions. Rats fled upward through the roots of broken trees. The air itself seemed to hum with the memory of sound. For the gunners, too, it was a war of endurance. Their ears ruptured, their hands blistered from handling shells heated by friction. Some went deaf permanently and continued firing, counting seconds between recoil and reload by instinct. They memorized the vibrations instead of the sound. The German Medical Corps recorded dozens of cases of artilleryman's paralysis hands that trembled uncontrollably, even in rest, as if still absorbing the recoil. One lieutenant's medical note simply reads, "Cannot stop hearing thunder." Back home, propaganda posters celebrated the might of German artillery eagles perched on cannons, lightning bolts wrapped around shells. Children collected miniature brass shell casings as souvenirs. In Berlin, a popular saying emerged, "Our thunder keeps the fatherland safe." But on the front, the same thunder was eating men alive. The crews rotated every 6 weeks, though replacements often found themselves back at the guns within a month. The Empire's appetite for destruction left no rest. The Allies began to adapt. By late 1916, counter-battery intelligence had improved. Sound-ranging technology, crude microphones buried in the mud, attempted to triangulate the origin of German guns. When successful Allied artillery could answer fire with fire. Yet the results were uneven. The sFH-13's mobility, its ability to relocate quickly using horse teams, made it a phantom. "We chase their ghosts," one British lieutenant wrote, "and the ghosts keep firing." Factories in France and Britain rushed to produce equivalents: the French 155 mm howitzer, the British BL 6-inch 26 cm tilt. They matched range, sometimes exceeded it, but not endurance. The German gun's simplicity was its genius. Its breech block could be cleaned with a rag and reassembled in minutes. The recoil system, though heavy, rarely failed. Even when the barrel wore out, field engineers could swap it on-site using makeshift cranes. The weapon refused to die. By the time Verdun reached its peak in mid-1916, the forests had become moonscapes. Journalists visiting after the battle described a world without color, everything gray, black, or red. The French soldiers who survived called it La Forêt de Fer, the Iron Forest. Within it, fragments of the sFH-13's shells still glowed hot hours after impact. Men stumbled upon twisted barrels, shattered wheels, limbs indistinguishable from roots. And somewhere beyond that, ruined fresh guns were already being prepared. It is easy in hindsight to see the sFH-13 as a machine efficient, monstrous, perfect. But to the men who operated it, it was also a companion. In one letter recovered from a German corporal named Otto Feldman, the words blur between pride and horror. She roars for us, and we for her. Without her, we are naked. With her, we are gods, and gods are lonely. Fact becomes folklore. The Allies told stories that the Germans could summon storms at will, that the Howitzers fired not shells but curses. The Germans, in turn, whispered that their guns had souls, that if a crewman died, the weapon would misfire until his spirit was avenged. No one truly believed it yet. No one dared dismiss it either. Because when the 15 centimeter sFH-13 spoke, it seemed less like a weapon and more like an oracle, ancient, metallic, unrelenting. By the end of that year, the weapon had done what rifles could not. It had reshaped belief itself. Men no longer feared armies. They feared the sound that came before them. And somewhere between calculation and chaos, between recoil and silence, the German 15 centimeters sFH-13 had achieved something only myth could explain. It had made thunder obey. Night in the forest was supposed to bring rest, but on the Western Front it only meant a different kind of tension, one drawn tight between darkness and memory. When the guns slept, the men did not. Every creak of the trees sounded like another shell taking breath. Every gust of wind carried the phantom whistle of dissent. In that black stillness, the human mind became its own battlefield. A single cough could set off a chain of panic hands reaching for helmets, bodies diving into mud that was half water, half grave. The German artillerymen knew this. They had seen what their barrages did not only to flesh, but to thought. And so when orders came for the next assault, they prepared not for victory, but for orchestration. The forest would be their instrument, and the 15 centimeter sFH-13 their conductor's baton. There, it is March 1916. Verdun burns like a furnace. The fortress city is drowning under steel, and in the woods north of the Meuse River. Battery 743 receives its target grid, Fleury-Thiaumont-Douaumont. The coordinates are etched on paper smudged with grease. Captain Heinrich Luttwitz studies them through a lens cracked by recoil. His face looks older than his 31 years, eyes ringed by soot fingers black from oil and frost. Around him his crew works in a silence older than language. One man, Franz the loader, mutters numbers like a prayer. 2 rounds per minute. Range 8,200 meters. Fuse delay 3 seconds. They know it all by heart, and yet each shot feels like the first. Outside, the forest has turned to sludge. Horses collapse under the weight of ammunition carts. Dead branches float on the surface of craters filled with rain. When the first command comes, fire the night lights up. The cannon recoils, a flash of orange slicing through fog. Within seconds, the air is alive with echoes overlapping, indistinguishable. Luttwitz's men move automatically, load, lock, fire, breathe. The rhythm of death. Between firings, the captain glances upward. The trees sway as if exhaling the blast. He thinks for a fleeting second that even nature is keeping time with them. Across the valley in the Allied trenches, the reaction is immediate. The French 106th Regiment huddles beneath collapsed planks, their commanding officer shouting orders drowned by the blast. Couchez-vous bas les têtes. Men press their faces into the earth. They can feel the vibration through their ribs, the slow rumble of another world breaking above them. Lieutenant Jean Morel, age 22, writes in his notebook by candlelight as shells fall. The sound comes before the fear, and the fear before the thought. The candle trembles. He continues writing until the flame goes out, then keeps moving his pencil against the paper, tracing nothing. The barrage lasts 40 minutes. Then silence, but it isn't silence. The ringing in the ears is louder than any explosion. On the German side, Captain Luttwitz signals a ceasefire. He removes his gloves, revealing hands blistered raw. That's enough, he murmurs. But the word enough means nothing here. A runner arrives with fresh orders: shift coordinates by 200 meters north. New targets. The map looks the same. The men reload. Somewhere behind them, a supply column creaks forward with more shells. At dawn, the fog lifts to reveal a landscape unrecognizable. The forest is no longer forest, only splintered poles reaching skyward like bones. Smoke hangs low, tinted yellow by dust. Luttwitz steps outside the gun pit, his boots sinking deep. The smell of explosives mixes with rot. He finds what remains of a French observation post, a stretch of ground where the soil still smolders. There is no trace of men, only the impression of sandbags fused into glass. He stares for a long time, expression unreadable, then turns back to the guns. The next coordinates are already coming in. In a letter found decades later among his belongings, he writes, "We are all trapped inside the machine, not beside it inside. It breathes for us." He was right. The 15 centimeter sFH-13 demanded more than labor. It demanded identity. The men who served it began to measure themselves by its efficiency, how fast they could load, how perfectly they could calculate the angle. Errors were not human failings. They were mechanical defects to be corrected. Sleep became irrelevant. Emotion, a liability. The crew functioned as an extension of the weapon, their hearts synchronized to recoil. On the other side of no man's land, Allied survivors emerge from the craters. Sergeant William Grant of the British 32nd Division surveys the ruins with disbelief. "There used to be a line of trees," he says to no one. "They're gone. Even their shadows are gone." He picks up a fragment of shell casing, its edge glowing faintly in the dawn light. Stamped into the metal Rheinmetall 1915. He turns it over in his hand, then pockets it not as a trophy, but as proof that something beyond human had touched the earth here. The psychological toll deepens. Allied medical units record a rising number of shell shock cases, men trembling uncontrollably, muttering numbers, unable to distinguish thunder from bombardment. Doctors try to explain it in terms of concussion or trauma, but the soldiers themselves use simpler words. The woods remember, they say. The ground hums. The 15 centimeter sFH-13 has turned the landscape into a living thing, one that breathes violence long after the guns stop firing. Meanwhile, German high command grows intoxicated with its own success. Reports of Allied withdrawals arrive daily, and every victory is attributed to artillery supremacy. At headquarters, General Falkenhayn boasts, "We will bleed France white." The phrase becomes a prophecy. Verdun turns into a grinder, and the sFH-13 becomes its teeth. For every meter gained, 1,000 shells are fired. For every gun destroyed, 2 more arrive. The Empire's factories roar like extensions of the battlefield. Smoke from Essen and Dusseldorf mirrors the smoke from Verdun industry, and death in perfect harmony. But even machines have limits. By mid-1916, barrels begin to fail from overuse. Metal fatigues, grooves erode, accuracy falters. Crews patch them with improvised welds, cooling them with buckets of water. When a barrel bursts, it does so without warning. A flash, a crack, and men are erased instantly. The fragments of the gun fall back into the mud, indistinguishable from the bodies that served it. Replacement crews arrive within hours, unflinching. Orders are orders. The thunder must not stop. One night under a blood-red sky, Luttwitz sits alone beside his gun. The crew sleeps in shifts. He listens not for enemy fire, but for the absence of it. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls its voice strange in this place. He lights a cigarette, watches the smoke twist upward. In his notebook, he writes, "I used to believe the forest belonged to us. Now I think we belong to it." He pauses, then adds, "If hell has a sound, it is not screaming. It is waiting." At the same hour on the other side of the line, Lieutenant Morel wakes from a dream of silence. He cannot remember what it was like before the guns. He steps outside his dugout, sees snow falling through smoke. Each flake glows faintly from the reflection of distant fires. He looks toward the woods where the German guns sleep, and whispers, "Maybe they hate it too." He does not know that Luttwitz is writing the same thought miles away. The battle drags on. Months blend into seasons. The sFH-13 continues to speak, though its tone changes hoarser, heavier. By late 1916, the Howitzers have become symbols of fatigue as much as power. Crews rotate, officers replaced, yet the guns remain. When new recruits arrive, they touch the barrel for luck. Some claim to hear a hum beneath the metal as if the gun is alive. The veterans only smile grimly. It is alive, they say. It remembers every shell. A French prisoner captured near Fort Douaumont is interrogated by German officers. When asked what the Allies think of the German artillery, he answers simply, "We do not think of it. We survive it if we can." His words make the officers laugh, but Lutwitz, standing nearby, feels no humor. He understands. Even the victors of this thunder are victims of its echo. In December, the snows deepen. Supply lines freeze. The guns are silent for the first time in weeks. The forest lies still covered in white, peaceful, almost beautiful. Men dare to breathe again. Then at noon the order arrives, new offensive, new coordinates. Within minutes, the white world erupts into black smoke and flame. Snow turns red, the thunder returns patient and precise. And so the cycle continues. Human will dissolves into repetition, identity into duty. The German crews keep firing. The Allies keep enduring. Between them, the forest keeps dying and being reborn in sound. No one knows anymore where the front begins or ends. The line is not on the map. It is inside the mind. The sFH-13 has done more than shape battlefields. It has rewritten the rhythm of existence. Men now dream in intervals of detonation, wake in silences that feel like threats. The war has found its heartbeat, and it beats to the tempo of thunder. By the beginning of 1917, the thunder had changed sides. The same weapon that once broke Allied lines now faced a mirror image of itself, shells returning, in-kind strategies, copied mathematics, reversed. The 15 cm sFH-13 had taught its enemies too well. Across the trenches, British and French engineers had studied its every secret, its recoil system, its shell curvature, even the angle of its blast cone, and now they brought it back against its makers. For the first time, the German gunners found themselves under the same storm they had unleashed. February Somme sector. The snow still clings to the ruined forest, but the horizon flickers with new light. Allied batteries open fire with precision unseen months before. Their shells fall closer, their patterns tighter. German trenches vanish under dust. The men who once laughed at counter-battery fire now huddle beneath the earth, clutching their ears as the air caves in. One gun crew stationed near Bapaume reports losing 2/3 of their unit within minutes, killed not by shrapnel, but by collapsed lungs crushed by pressure. And yet, through ruin, the guns keep firing. The sFH-13 was never designed to retreat. Even when mud swallows the wheels, even when barrels warp the crews, force it to live. They rebuild from fragments, scavenging steel from wrecked carriages, melting shell casings to patch the cracks. Each repair is an act of defiance. In the words of Sergeant Franz Ritter, whose letters were later found buried under a collapsed dugout, "The gun must never sleep before we do. If it falls silent, we fall silent with it." The German High Command begins to pull back. Their once unstoppable artillery now faces shortages of ammunition and fuel. The Allied naval blockade chokes industry. Shells arrive slower, powder weaker. But the engineers at Krupp and Rheinmetall continue their grim work, modifying, adapting, stretching the lifespan of the old designs. Some barrels are fitted with new liners to extend range. Others receive reinforced breech locks for hotter charges. The weapon evolves in desperation, a testament to both genius and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the human toll deepens beyond comprehension. Each day, thousands of men on both sides live within earshot of the guns. They eat to its rhythm, sleep to its echoes, dream in its cadence. The sound has become part of their physiology, an organ of fear that cannot be removed. Doctors record new symptoms: trembling hands, blank stares, spontaneous deafness. Shell shock, they call it, though it's not the shell, but the expectation of it that breaks the mind. At Verdun, French medics find soldiers who no longer respond to orders. They sit in mud, staring into the distance, lips moving silently, as if counting invisible shells. Some hum to themselves an unconscious mimicry of the rising pitch of artillery. The mind, unable to endure randomness, begins to create rhythm out of chaos. The 15 cm sFH-13 has rewritten the human sense of time. Inside the German positions, morale begins to fracture. Rumors spread of new Allied superweapons, long-range howitzers, that can reach 20 kilometers, capable of flattening cities. Some say the British have learned to guide their shells by sound. Others claim the French are firing gas-filled rounds that scream like dying men. The truth is less dramatic, but no less deadly. The Allies have simply learned efficiency. Where the Germans once measured victory by volume, the Allies now measure it by precision. Each shot counts. Still, for every advance, the sFH-13 leaves its mark. During the spring offensive at Arras, British troops capture a ridge only to find an abandoned German gun half buried in mud, still warm from its last shot. Its crew lies nearby, frozen mid-motion. A field engineer examining it writes, "Even in death, it points west." The phrase becomes legend. Soldiers whisper it as they march, "It points west." In Berlin, newspapers still print tales of the great thunder that guards the fatherland. Photographs of smiling gun crews appear under headlines like, "Our boys at the front." But the truth beneath the ink grows darker. Factory workers labor 16-hour shifts to keep up with demand, women assembling shells in dim workshops filled with yellow fumes. They call themselves canary girls, their skin stained by picric acid. The thunder of the front is built on the coughing of the home. Spring turns to summer, and with it comes the great test, the Allied counteroffensives. The British use creeping barrages perfected from the German playbook. The French deploy new 155mm guns, heavier than anything before. The sky becomes a duel of sound. Even airships above the lines report turbulence from the pressure waves. A pilot writes, "It feels like flying through lungs that are breathing war." For the German artillerymen, survival becomes an act of ritual. Each morning they check the breech oil, the recoil cylinders polish the barrel until it gleams faintly through soot. They talk to the gun as if it were alive. Some give it nicknames: Gretel Donnerkind, St. Barbara's hand. Before firing, they touch the barrel and murmur small prayers. The superstition binds them together, a fragile defense against the unrelenting logic of the battlefield. Among them is Corporal Hans Reiter, age 24, stationed near Lens. His diary, recovered decades later, tells of exhaustion beyond sleep. "We no longer hear the shells as others do," he writes. "We feel them through the ground, like the heartbeat of a buried animal. Sometimes the earth shivers before they come, and we whisper thanks, because at least it means we are still alive." He describes nights when the moon turns red from the dust, when the forest glows as if burning from within. The thunder has become part of the weather, he says. But in 1917, the weather changes again. The United States enters the war. Fresh troops, new industry, limitless ammunition. The balance tilts. The German guns continue to fire, but the thunder no longer feels infinite. For the first time, German positions suffer sustained counter-barrages that match or exceed their own. The myth of invincibility fractures. Even the officers begin to sense the inevitability. One colonel remarks bitterly, "We taught the world how to destroy us." The turning point comes at Passchendaele. The mud is so deep that men drown standing up. Guns sink into the earth. Crews use wooden planks as platforms, but the recoil drives them downward again. Horses die in droves, and still the shells must move. Men harness themselves to the wagons, dragging tons of ammunition by hand. Every shot fired is a victory over gravity itself. When the howitzers roar, the sound no longer inspires fear, only fatigue. Yet in that fatigue lies a strange unity. Across enemy lines, the men are the same, deaf, hollow-eyed, covered in the same ash. When the guns pause, both sides emerge cautiously from their trenches, staring toward the horizon that has erased their differences. The sound has made them kin. The war machine, however, does not share sentiment. Orders continue. New models replace the old, the sFH 1302, the sFH 1317. Slightly longer barrels, improved carriages, greater range. Evolution by necessity. Each iteration brings small refinements, but no salvation. The thunder continues colder, now stripped of glory. The soldiers have stopped calling it our gun. They call it the duty. By late 1917, the front is an open wound. Verdun, Ypres, Arras, Lens, the same names, the same echoes. A French journalist visiting the reclaimed forests writes, There are no trees left, only shadows of trees burned into the soil. Archaeologists a century later will confirm it, layers of carbonized wood fused with shell fragments, a geological record of human noise. The forest itself became archive, and through it all, the sFH-13 endures. Bent, battered, rusting, but still firing. It is the sound of persistence of a nation refusing to admit exhaustion. The men who serve it are ghosts already walking between explosions. Some carve names into the gun shields before battle, not their own, but of the towns they miss. One shield reads, "Leipzig waits," another, "Anna, forgive me." By winter, snow falls again, softening the craters. The thunder quiets for a moment. Smoke drifts lazily through the broken treetops. A German corporal kneels beside his gun, cleaning the breach one last time before rotation. His face is pale, eyes sunken. He looks at the weapon and whispers, "You were supposed to end all wars." The irony doesn't need words. The silence answers him. When he stands, a new order arrives. Another barrage, another map, another chorus of the same music. The thunder resumes. The cycle repeats. But something has changed, not in the weapon, but in the men. They have learned that even power can be hollow, that victory measured in decibels is still defeat in the soul. The 15 cm sFH-13 continues to roar through the woods, but now beneath its sound, another truth begins to stir, the quiet realization that the storm they summoned cannot be silenced, only inherited. By 1918, the thunder had become prophecy. The guns no longer spoke of victory, they spoke of endurance, of the last act of an empire unraveling in sound. The forest that once trembled beneath the 15 cm sFH-13 now trembled for other reasons: hunger, disease, exhaustion. The air reeked not only of powder, but of decay. Somewhere between the shattered trunks and the open fields of the Marne, a final chapter was being written, one where the machine itself seemed to hesitate, as if aware of its own futility. It is July. Dawn rises pale over the Aisne Valley. Mist clings to the ridges, and through it the faint shapes of German batteries can be seen, lines of weary men tending to weapons older than their faces. Their uniforms hang loose from starvation. Their boots leak water through cracks patched with wire. And yet, the ritual continues. Captain Heinrich Lutwitz, the same officer who once commanded at Verdun, now oversees a battery reduced to half strength. His hair has gone gray. His eyes hollow, still calculate range and elevation with mechanical precision. He mutters to himself as he aligns the barrel 2 degrees north. Elevation 38. Charge 3. The gun answers with its old, obedient shudder. Across the line, the Allied counterattack has begun. American troops, fresh, unbroken, their accents strange to this soil, surge forward through the haze. Their own artillery answers with ferocity. The sound is no longer one-sided. For the first time, the thunder feels shared, chaotic, indiscriminate. The battlefield vibrates like a drumhead stretched too tight. In the sky, aircraft circle, the first signs of a new age of war, silent observers compared to the roar below. Lutwitz's crew fires until the barrel glows dull red. The recoil jolts through their bones. When the order to cease comes, they collapse beside the weapon, ears, ringing, lungs full of smoke. The captain lowers his binoculars and sees the field beyond, nothing but craters and flame. There is no movement, no enemy, no victory. Only the echo that returns, delayed like a ghost of their own breath. He writes later in his notebook, "We no longer fight men. We fight the noise we made. By August, German lines are collapsing. Ammunition dwindles. Trains once filled with shells now carry the wounded. Yet the guns refuse to die. Every retreat is covered by the 15 cm batteries, the last guardians of a fading empire. The crews know it. They call themselves Die Letzten Donnerer, the last thunderers. They drag their howitzers through mud, across ruined bridges, down roads clogged with refugees. When they can no longer move them, they dig them in, turning them into fortresses of iron and desperation. One such position sits near the town of Soissons. A small grove of surviving trees shields it from aerial spotting. The crew is down to 9 men, most of them barely 20. The oldest, a mechanic named Otto Feldman, has become their anchor. He keeps the gun alive with wire, grease, and faith. His diary, later recovered by Allied patrols, describes the moment when faith itself began to fracture. We have been told the Americans are near. The shells arrive from 3 sides now. We load slower, but we still load. I dream of the old days when the forest sang with our thunder. Now it sounds like morning. At dusk, Feldman's battery fires its last round. The barrel splits down the center smoke, hissing out like a dying breath. No one cheers. They simply stare at it, the instrument that carried their lives for 4 years, now broken beyond repair. Someone mutters, "Sie ist müde," she is tired. The next morning, they are ordered to abandon it. They bury the breech under dirt, lay branches over the wheels, and march away without looking back. As the Germans retreat, the forest reclaims its dead. Rain fills the craters, frogs return to the puddles, moss grows over twisted shells. But beneath that fragile renewal lies something permanent, layers of metal embedded in soil fragments of the 15 cm sFH 13 rusting beside bones. Archaeologists will one day call it the Iron Horizon. To the men who walked through it in 1918, it was simply home. In the final weeks of the war, as the armistice looms, the thunder fades. The surviving guns fire sporadically, not in coordinated barrages, but as isolated, meaningless gestures. Each shot is less command than confession. On November 10th, one day before the silence, Captain Luttwitz receives the order, "Cease all fire at 11 Sugaros tomorrow." He reads it twice, then folds it neatly into his coat. That night he walks alone to his gun and sits beside it. The barrel still smells of oil. He runs his hand along its cold surface, whispering names of men long gone, of towns erased, of forests that once stood. "We did not lose," he says quietly. "We ended." At precisely 11 o'clock the next morning, the last sFH 13 of his battery fires its final shell. It arcs high through the pale November sky, vanishing into the clouds. Moments later, the signal comes, the war is over. Silence descends so abruptly that men weep from the absence. Birds return hesitantly. The air, once filled with vibration, feels hollow, fragile. And in that fragile stillness, the legacy of thunder lingers unseen but everywhere. The aftermath unfolds slowly. In the years that follow, the 15 cm sF13 becomes both relic and blueprint. The victorious nations study it, replicate its mechanisms, improve upon its range. It will appear again in newer forms, in newer wars. The sFH-18, the 105 mm Leaf H-18, the echoes of its design spanning decades. Engineers dissect its hydraulics, its breech geometry, its balance of weight and recoil. Historians call it a turning point in artillery, the moment war became science. But those who served it know better. For them it was not science. It was sentence. Feldman never returned to his trade. In 1920 he was seen wandering the ruins of the Argonne searching for his old gun. Locals recalled a man who spoke softly to the earth, as if listening for something beneath it. They said he claimed to hear the heartbeat, still slow, distant, patient. Perhaps he did. The earth had absorbed too much sound to forget. Meanwhile, Europe tries to rebuild. Farmers plow fields littered with steel, unearthing shells that never exploded. Children play among the remains, their laughter mingling with rust. In some places, the soil still smokes when it rains, remnants of powder sealed underground. The forests regrow unevenly. Some trees sprout twisted from the shockwaves that altered the land beneath. The echo of artillery has become part of the landscape's DNA. In museums, the 15 cm FH-13 stands polished and silent. Tourists stare at it without hearing the sound that once defined an age. They see numbers on plaques. Kilograms, 8 500 meters, 43 kilogram shells, but not the weight of memory those numbers conceal. For the veterans who visit it is not nostalgia they feel, but recognition, as if meeting an old ghost that remembers them too. Luttwitz dies in 1933, the same year Germany begins rearming. In his final note found tucked between faded photographs, he writes, "The forest was never the enemy. We were." His words go unread until long after his death. But by then, the thunder has already returned, louder, faster, mechanized. The old sFH-13s are melted down to forge new guns, new wars, new silences. Yet the echo never truly fades. In the quiet woods of Verdun, when the wind rises through the trees, locals swear they can still hear it. a deep, rolling tremor like the earth remembering a language it once spoke fluently. Scientists dismiss it as coincidence, acoustics, the rumble of distant traffic. But the old men of the villages shake their heads. They know better. They say the forest itself keeps time with the dead, and so the final entry closes not with triumph, but with resonance. The 15 Sambiapapai sFH 13, once the roar of empire, now rests as silence's twin. Its thunder gave shape to fear, to endurance, to the limits of human creation. It proved that sound could conquer not only armies, but souls. In its wake, the world learned that silence is never the opposite of noise, only its shadow. In the archive of war, the last record is a vibration. The camera pans across a quiet field, grass growing over rusted wheels, the outlines of forgotten trenches barely visible beneath moss. Somewhere beneath, the last fragments of iron dream in patience. The forest breathes again. But if you listen closely, through the wind, through the distance, through the soft hum of history itself, you can still hear it, faint, eternal, the heartbeat of thunder. The forest did not close its wounds quickly, it kept them like a patient who refuses to forget. After the guns fell silent, after the last orders were folded into pockets, and the final telegrams crossed borders, the men returned in fragments. Some came back whole in body and broken in spirit. Others did not come back at all. The 15 Samedi sFH 13 remained in pieces in memory and metal, and with it came a trace that would outlive treaties, borders, and the men who had fired those last rounds. The aftermath is not a tidy ledger of victories and losses. It is sediment layers of meaning, accusation, grief, engineering, and myth piled into the earth where the thunder once rolled. Fields that had been battlefields became archives of sound. Farmers plowed up shrapnel and bone. Children found rusted fragments and turned them into toys or warnings. Municipal councils met to decide what to do with the ruins, to leave them as graves, to clear them for new life, or to curate them as museums of warning. In towns once shelled into silence, new voices emerged to narrate the story. Schoolteachers, archivists, veterans who survived and kept journals folded into their waistcoats. They brought artifacts to light, a shell casing stamped with a factory mark, a bent wheel still bearing a name scratched into its rim, a charred piece of wood that matched the pattern of a German stretcher. These objects, ordinary and terrible, became evidence and testimony at once. They populated museums where machines were labeled with dry numbers, caliber, production year range, and beneath those plates, the visitors pressed their palms to glass as if they could feel the echo. Scholars cataloged the thunder scientifically. Ballistics experts measured blast radii and fragmentation patterns. Metallurgists traced the alloys back to specific foundries. Logisticians mapped the supply chains that fed the guns, horse teams, rail convoys, munition trains that never seemed to end. The numbers were precise tons of metal, yards of cordite, hours of factory labor. The weapons specifications, 149 millimeters a shell weight. In the tens of kilograms, a range measured in kilometers became a shorthand for an era in which war was planned like an industrial production line. Yet even the most careful tables could not account for the tremor in a man's hand, for the way a child who played with a spent casing dreamed nightmares of falling trees. Data explained capacity. It could not measure loss. Communities tried to reconcile the two. In village squares, they erected memorials, stone plinths with names carved into them, wreaths laid on Armistice Day, lines read aloud by trembling voices. In some places, the memorials were literal, the twisted axle of a howitzer bolted to a slab of concrete, a plaque that read simply, "For those who heard the thunder." In others, the memory was vanishing, a field reseeded with wheat, a path where once stood a trench, a child who did not know the sound that had shaped his grandfather's life. Reconciliation where it came was uneven. For some, the guns were a proud symbol of skill, for others a mark of terror. History, as always, refused to be monochrome. The veterans told their stories in different registers. Some spoke with mechanical detachment, describing angles and timers as if reciting the instructions of a machine. Others carried folklore in their speech, tales of barrels that would not fire until a lost comrade's name was called, of guns that shivered when a particular tune was sung, of trees that bled when struck. These stories threaded into public memory, shaping the way subsequent generations understood the past. Folklore softened the edges of fact, and fact hardened the edges of folklore. Together, they formed a narrative that could neither be wholly proven nor easily dismissed. Politicians and generals argued about culpability and necessity. In parliamentary hearings and private offices, men in suits measured the strategic value of artillery against its moral cost. Was the thunder a tactical innovation that shortened wars by delivering decisive blows, or an escalation that prolonged suffering by changing the calculus of destruction? The debates were never resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Military scholars cited doctrine and necessity. Moralists pointed to civilian villages rewritten into ruins. Lawmakers looked at treaties' reparations and the limits of industrial warfare and tried to legislate memory into policy. The law could name offenses. It could not so easily memorialize the tremor under a soldier's feet. Across the academic world, a generation of historians devoted themselves to unpicking the thread the Howitzers had dropped into history. They followed factory records back to towns where men had worked at lathes and presses, charted the movement of horses and wagons, read diaries for the cadence of orders. The narrative that emerged was not one of inevitable technological triumph, but of choices, political, economic, social, that made thunder possible. There was accountability in that research and also complicity. Nations mobilized economies, teachers trained engineers, soldiers learned to measure time by fused delay. The 15 centimeters sFH 13 was not an act of God. It was an act of men. Yet memory also became art. Poets wrote about the sound that had no name. Painters painted the negative space left where trees had been. Composers turned the rhythms of barrages into dissonant movements. These works, while never documentary, captured something the archives could not. The way thunder lived in the body, how a single blast could cleave a life into before and after. They preserved the subjective truth, not less real than the objective one, only different. Museums acquired these pieces alongside shells and shovels. School children read the poems aloud, their voices steady and deliberate. The thunder, once a weapon, became a cautionary image in the cultural imagination. Returning to the physical traces, archaeologists began to excavate systematically. Trenches were surveyed, fragments, dated soil layers analyzed for chemical residues of explosives. The ground itself yielded testimony, pockets of picric acid, compressed layers of ash bones intermingled with metal. Each layer told a chapter. The discipline of archaeology turned rumor into record, and in doing so it offered closure to families who had long wondered what happened to fathers and brothers whose names were on lists. The earth, stubborn in its silence, finally spoke. Even so, ambiguity remained. Some guns were salvaged, their barrels melted down for new industry. Others were preserved as monuments. In some museums, the 15 centimeter sFH 13 stood polished, its mechanics admired by engineering students. Elsewhere, it rested behind glass, a relic of inhumanity. Visitors debated whether it should be displayed at all, whether showing the instrument of death was an educational imperative or a grotesque spectacle. Exhibitions tried to balance reverence with analysis, context with empathy. Curators wrote labels that were sober and precise, but sometimes even the best caption could not cushion the shock of seeing a shell casing the size of a child's torso. And so the last word of the war did not belong to generals or scholars, but to the slow work of remembrance. The families who returned to fields sown with fragments planted saplings. The children who played among rusted wheels grew to tell others about the sound that once owned their afternoons. Towns held processions that honored both the living and the lost. Memory was not a single monument, but a living practice enacted every year on November mornings, in quiet conversations by hearths in the folding of flags. The thunder was transmuted into ritual. What remains of the 1515 centimeter sFH 13 is therefore both concrete and spectral. Its metal rusts, its specifications sit in manuals, its myth persists in tales told under low light. The gun changed how warfare was waged. It professionalized destruction, made survival contingent on mathematics and logistics, and taught armies to listen as much as to shoot. But it also transformed landscapes and languages, inserting a temporal rhythm of fear into the lives of those who lived under it. That rhythm echoes still in places where the wind moves through regrown boughs, and the ground keeps a memory deeper than the root. If there is a final lesson in these remains, it is a double one: technology can become destiny, and destiny can be resisted by remembering. The 15 sFH-13 was an instrument of state power, efficient, terrible, precise, but in the end, it was also an artifact of choices. The men who fired it were makers and victims both. The forests that absorbed its sound were witnesses. We keep the artifacts not to glorify the thunder, but to record it, to study it, and to ask again and again whether the ways we choose to fight are the ways we choose to live. What if they had understood sooner? Would the forests have been spared? Next, we will follow a different lineage of weapons, one that learned from the sFH-13 and turned calculation into control. And we will ask how each new sound of war reshaped the people who listened.